Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting. Notice is hereby given that in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, the laws of 1975, notice of this meeting has been sent to all school offices, officially designated newspapers, filed with the Township Clerk, and posted in the Board of Education office 48 hours in advance of this meeting. Roll call, please.
Certainly. Mrs. Berkowitz?
Here.
Mrs. Pintarelli?
Here.
Mrs. Rothenberg? Here. Mr. Schlereth?
Here.
Mr. White?
Here.
And Mr. Rossini.
Here. Flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. So regarding the board president's report, the first thing I want to mention is tonight we have Mr. Matt Lee joining us to provide board training. Mr. Lee is a field representative from the New Jersey School Boards, which is a nonpartisan state-created federation of boards of education founded in 1914 and represents over 580 public school districts. We welcome Mr. Lee to Rivervale and look forward to his presentation later this evening. Thank you, Mr. Lee, for coming. What else? Oh, I wanted to mention the Holdrum concert, which I attended. Now, I think that was our first time back in a long time. I know it was. And it was just a terrific experience. It's terrific to see the kids out there playing, singing, the parents. I think it was a great success for everyone. And I think anyone who was there would probably say the same. With regard to upcoming events, exciting events, elementary schools are going to have their concerts. And Holdrum Play will be coming up soon, too. So lots of fun things moving forward. So, and that's my report for tonight. So we'll move on to the board president's report. I'm sorry. The committee reports. Buildings and Grounds, Mr. Schlereth.
Yeah, just a couple of things to report. We received the project manager's report for all the construction going on at the 3 schools. Just a couple highlights for the month of February. EPIC conducted their pre-construction meeting with the contractors on February 9th and February 10th. All contract agreement forms have been fully executed. All applications for the building permits have been submitted to the building department. Contractors have begun procuring materials and equipment for review and approval by Land Associates, and the abatement and removal of the vinyl asbestos floor tile at Holdrum was completed on February 19th through February 21st. Also, we received 2 bids for the roof replacement project at Woodside, and we'll be voting on that tonight. In March, all 3 schools, the contractors are working on the procurement of subcontractors and submittals, hoping to have some of that done, but the 2 elementary schools don't start construction just yet. And at Holdrum, the temporary construction fencing was installed, as well as the office trailer. The building permit has been issued, site demolition and some demolition in room 117, as well as groundbreaking for the addition is expected to commence this month.
Okay, great, thank you. Communications and Policies, Mrs. Sanande. Oh, she's not here. Is there anything that we need to discuss? No. Okay, Curriculum and Technology, Mrs. Rothenberg.
No, as I keep mentioning, anything that you missed is on the website regarding the curriculum and the testing, and our next meeting is May 10th.
Okay. Finance, Mrs. Pintarelli.
Yes. Governor Murphy released state aid figures on March 10th, and the district received $1,108,962. However, we were hit with a debt service assessment of $50,531 for a net total for the 2022-2023 school year of $1,058,431. Sorry, $58,431 in state aid. So that's great news, and this is the most state aid Rivervale has ever received. So we're very happy with that. We also met with our auditor earlier to discuss the synopsis of the audit for the year ending June 30th, 2021. There were no deficiencies cited, clean opinions in all audit areas. There was only one minor recommendation in the way we encumber contracts. So I'd like to thank Ms. Ippolito and her staff for all their hard work during the year and during this process. So that's it for tonight.
Okay, thank you. With regard to negotiations, there's nothing to report tonight. And again, Mrs. Pintarelli, anything on personnel?
Nothing for tonight.
Okay. Everyone can take note of the committee meeting schedules, please. And now I will discuss public comments on agenda items only. The Rivervale Board of Education is committed to encouraging the citizens of Rivervale and employees of the Rivervale School District to speak directly to board trustees. In order to facilitate this communication, residents and employees are requested, 1, to sign in before speaking, 2, to maintain an appropriate sense of decorum, and 3, to limit their remarks to no more than 5 minutes. The board will also take under advisement the written comments and opinions of non-residents that are submitted to the board secretary. Being mindful of its responsibility to maintain the orderly conduct of meetings, the board retains the right to rule on such matters as the speaker's right to address the board, as well as the appropriateness of the subject being presented. The board's decision in such matters is final. The board also reminds all members of the public that while it subscribes without reservation to the principle of keeping the community informed by policy and law, it cannot allow public discussion of personnel matters, nor can trustees comment on any current or pending litigation. If a matter concerning an employee of the Rivervale Public Schools is of interest or concern to a resident, the matter should be referred to the responsible building principal or the superintendent of schools by telephone, letter, or email. So, with regard to public comments, I will open the meeting to public comments on agenda items only at approximately 7:08 p.m. Okay. Seeing no one who wants to make a public comment on the agenda items, I'm going to close it at approximately 7:09 p.m. And then now I'm going to move on to the superintendent's report.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I would like to bring to the board's attention that there's a job description for a non-instructional school nurse on the agenda tonight. This is due to a different certification that's issued from the State Department, which allows school districts to hire school nurses that are either certified to teach health or certified for nursing duties only. As a result, we had to create a job description that matches this certification. We also updated our instructional nurse job description and our nurse's aide job description. These updates are not to reflect any changes in our current nursing staff duties or our current nursing staff at all. We're just ensuring that we are in compliance. So if you see that, that's to help explain that for tonight. And now I would also like to introduce Matt Lee. He is a former board member and served as a board member for 20 years, as a board president for 10, and also chaired the finance committee. So please welcome Matt Lee. Thank you.
Got the green. Good evening, everybody. Nice to meet you all. I've been with New Jersey School Boards Association for about 6 years now, and this is my second time in Rivervale, so I'm happy to be invited back here. For those of you who don't know, my role within the association is as a field service representative, and my territory is all of Bergen County. So if you've been to county meetings for NJSBA, or if you've attended any regional trainings, I am the one who is usually giving those talks, and you know, I've enjoyed my time in Bergen County. I live just outside the county, so I've gotten to know many places here and many board members, and it's really something I really enjoy doing. So I'm happy to be here tonight to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that board members are responsible for, and some of the things that some of you may be familiar with, and some of the things you may be refreshed on. And I don't know about you, but I'm still consistently learning new things about board service and the role of a board within the governance function of a district. So I think you all have a copy of the presentation. I'm going to run through the slides here as we talk through them. I really encourage you to ask questions, to make comments, and to kind of turn this into a conversation as best we can. So let's begin. I have to do this, I think, because the computer is in the back. I'm going to move a little closer to that. There we go. It caught up. Okay. So one of the things that's often surprising to new board members is that the authority that a board member has in working within their governance role in the district actually comes from the state. Now, it's a little bit counterintuitive because you as board members are put in place usually by the election of your community members, right? But the actual authority to run the district or to oversee the district, I should say, comes from the legislature. And that comes this way. So beginning with the New Jersey State Constitution, which gives the authority to run education within the state to the legislature. The legislature then in turn has created a body to implement that, which is known as the New Jersey Department of Education. They have the authority to carry out the mandates that have been issued by the state. And then going down to the local level, some of the policies that are issued by the state can then be modified and adopted by local boards of education. So it really is sort of a chain, if you will, of authority that gets passed down and eventually ends up locally for boards of education to put their local stamp on the mandates of the state. So the board represents the state in one sense. It represents the community. You have an obligation to take community input and to express the wishes of the community to the administration for how you want education to be provided within the district. And then in the end, of course, we're listening to students. Our whole reason for being here is to advance student success within the district. So what is it that school board members do? Well, you hear this constantly, that boards are policy-making bodies. And policy obviously serves the purpose of giving the administration a plan, if you will, or a playbook with which to administer the district day to day. The idea between policies is to create a clear expression of what the board hopes to have happen in the district. And then there's also a section of policies that is called bylaws. And the bylaws are the ways in which the board has chosen to operate itself. So that's the policy piece for boards. In addition, board members are about planning. And that's where this visionaries, goal setters piece comes in. Annually, and sometimes over long term, boards will set out a plan for the district. So your annual goals constitute a plan for the next 12 months for the district. And sometimes boards engage in strategic planning, which really puts in place a long-term plan for the improvement of the district. Once putting that plan in place with the cooperation of the superintendent, the board is then responsible for oversight of that plan. Are the things that we had planned to have happen progressing well? And if they're not, that's a conversation with our superintendent in order to adjust and move forward in the direction that the board set out. And then finally, communicators. We talked about the fact that the board is a conduit, if you will, for the expressions of the community to the administration, and then also providing the positioning of the district to the community. You'll notice in that smaller type in that purple box there that we say for provide two-way communication, provide for, I should say, two-way communication with the community in the school district. What that means is that boards themselves don't typically do direct communication with the district, with the community. The reason being that most of the things that the community needs to know about the district are really related to the operational aspects of the district day to day. There are some instances where a board might communicate directly, but they're kind of rare. The board is, however, responsible for ensuring that there is a robust communications plan and set of media for which the community can access school information. One of the things we're going to talk about a lot tonight is this term governance. And what we try to do is to draw the distinction between governance and management. Dead on me, huh? So, as you can see here, governance is derived actually from a Greek word that is meant to imply the steering of a ship. Right? Management, on the other side, the administration's role, is the rowing piece. So boards set the direction, and management provides the resources to get there. Another way to look at the board's role within a district is through a visual analogy. So we see here that the board looks at things high level, as seen through a telescope, whereas the administration has the up close and detailed view, as you might see through a microscope. The idea here is that the board's concentration should be on vision, should be on long term, should be on strategy. The administration is in place to handle the day-to-day. Another way that we draw the distinction is to talk about the difference between the what and the how. In our goals, boards express the what that they want to see happen within the district. The superintendent, on the other side of the coin, runs the how. How is it we're going to execute that? And then the board, of course, oversees the progress against those goals. Quick, corny, and JSBA riddle. How many board members does it take to screw in a light bulb? I get to stand here until you answer, so. What's that? A quorum? Okay. Interesting answer. What else? Anybody else have a guess? Well, you're close, right? So there's the answer. None. Board members don't screw in light bulbs. Board members say, let there be light. What's the goal? What do we want to achieve? Right? The superintendent then says, all right, it's my job to figure out where this light's going to go, how many hours a day it's going to be on, what's the mechanism that turns it on and off, where is it going to be positioned, what kind of bulbs are we going to use, et cetera, right? That's the execution. That's the how part. Then the board not only approves the purchase of the light bulbs, right? So they are working with the superintendent to put that plan into place, but then they evaluate the quality of the light, right? That's the oversight piece. And if the light isn't really achieving what it is the board had hoped for, then there's a conversation, right? The conversation is, how can we really get to the end that we were hoping for? And then the superintendent can adjust, and then we move forward, right? So real distinction there between the role of the board and the role of the superintendent. If you've been through NJSBA training, this may be familiar to you. We say it a lot, and it's a very simple sort of sentence, but it isn't always as easy to see when you're in the midst of it where your responsibilities end and where the board, or where the superintendents begin, right? The role of a board of education is not to run the schools, but to see that they are well run. And I think the easiest way that I've come to keep my eye on that as a board member was to focus on outcomes, right? It's not how we got there, but did we steer in the direction that we set out, right? Focus on the outcomes. The superintendent gets to worry about the how part. So where does this come from, right? Where does this division of responsibilities originate? Well, it originated many years back, of course, but it was actually codified in the Code of Ethics. And if you look at Tenet D, there are 10 tenets in the Code of Ethics. Tenet D says, I will carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they are well run. And I stole this directly out of our ethics presentation because I wanted to draw your attention to what appears underneath the tenet in that standards part. The standards part is actually what the School Ethics Commission would look at to determine whether or not you were in violation of the Code of Ethics with activity that you may have been involved in, right? And highlighted in red there are the words, there was direct involvement in activities or functions that are the responsibility of school personnel or the day-to-day administration of the school district. So it's pretty clear right there that the board is expected to not partake in functions that belong to school personnel. One of the things that can kind of trip up your newer board members is that the mode in which they are operating when they become seated as board members is entirely different than the mode that they were operating in when they were trying to become board members. In other words, campaigning, right? We're referencing a book in this quote here. The book is called The Governance Core. Highly recommend it. We're actually going to do a leadership program about this in the beginning of June. It's really, it really delves into the foundational concepts around what a board should be doing and what the superintendent should be doing. And I think one of these this quote that we have here is really helpful to talk about how you make the transition from a candidate to a board member. And within that book, they say it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to carry out the systemic government responsibilities of the trustee if he or she is not driven by only one interest or belief and does not make the transition to the full board strategic agenda. So you have to flip that switch when you become seated and start to think about the board as a whole, not about the things that you had meant to do or thought you could do as a board candidate. You have to remember as a board member, you can't do anything on your own. Even though you may have campaigned individually, you have to realize you're now part of a team. And you didn't get to pick that team, and you may not even like that team, but that's the team that you have to function in. So we talked about functions of the Board of Education. On a slide prior, we often talk about the 4 functions of a board. We already talked about policy. The planning piece is that vision and strategy that we talked about before. The oversight and appraisal piece actually is executed by evaluating the superintendent, holding them accountable, and having those continuous conversations with the superintendent that make sure that we're on track with the long-term and the annual goals that have been set for the district. So that's your oversight and appraisal piece. And then, of course, the providing for two-way communication, which we've already discussed. One of the other things that I found helpful, especially when talking to new board members or folks who may have a lot of their experience in the corporate world, is that there is a real sort of division of inputs, if you will, to the goals of the school district. And each stakeholder group has a very real and significant piece of those educational goals. But they are also in concert with the visibility of those stakeholder groups into what happens in schools day to day. So when you start at the top of the chart there, you see the community. Now the community has very little visibility into what actually happens day to day, the community at large, I'm saying, in a school district. So what we take from the community is what do they value and what do they aspire for within their school district? And again, that's a very real contribution to how the district moves forward. When we get to the board level, we look at the board's ability to have, you know, a little bit greater insight into what's going on in the district so they can prioritize things, working with the superintendent. They have approval and oversight responsibilities, and they also have to supply the resources, right, through the passing of our budget. And then, of course, they appraise the progress on the goals throughout the course of the year. The superintendent and their team are where we actually define the programs and the tactics and where they actually apply the resources provided by the board. And then lastly, but not at all least, is the educators, right? That's where we have the delivery of content, we have assessment of students, and we have the adaptation and presentation of, and personalization, I should say, of material to make sure that all students succeed. And I want to draw your attention to the overlays that we have there, because often new folks to the board or folks who come from a corporate perspective look at a SMART goal and say, well, why isn't the board setting all of the items in a SMART goal? Well, they're not, because the division of responsibilities is different on a board than it is in a company, right? In a company, you'd expect one unit, business unit, for example, to not only come up with the goals, right, but also be responsible for executing on those goals. In this case, we work in concert with the superintendent to find goals that are achievable, that are relevant, and that have a time limit to them, right? But then the superintendent supplies the how part. That's the specific piece and the measurable piece. And again, the board oversees that whole process. So there is a very clear distinction between the way a company might approach goals and the way a board approaches goals. Does that all make sense? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to skip over this next one, I hope. There we go. Okay. This is really important, again, especially to new board members, to realize that any authority that they have is only as a part of the body, right? Aside from your work in a legally constituted meeting of the board, you have no authority in this district. You have the same authority as any other citizen would. You cannot make decisions for the board. You can't give unilateral direction to the superintendent. And of course, by extension, you can't direct members of the staff in any way, shape, or form. Quick question, how many employees does the board have? Anybody else? One. The board employs one person, superintendent. Everyone else in the district works for the superintendent. So from there is where direction comes, not from board members, right? Individual board members can't take actions for the board, nor can they speak for the board, either verbally or written, unless the board authorized them to do so. The authorization for being the spokesperson of the board would come where? Where do we document how we operate as a board? In your bylaws, right? That's where we would outline who it is that speaks for the board. Now, typically it's going to be the board president, but sometimes board presidents aren't comfortable in that role, so they'll designate someone else. But the board should unite behind a single voice, right? And present a consistent position to the public. Okay. Is everyone familiar with the concept of chain of command? Okay. The way chain of command works is often something that new board members will encounter and at first really kind of not quite know what to do, right? Because they feel like, oh, I was just elected, I should be able to solve problems, I should be able to speak for my community. And it shouldn't really work that way, because the governing principle here is that you don't have any authority on the operational side of the district, right? So if someone were to come to you with an issue, and it's happened to us all, in the supermarket or on the soccer field or whatever it might be, there's probably something substantial going on there that's of grave concern to a member of the public, and you'll expect that, but that's not something you can deal with, right? So the idea here is that you can listen to that problem, but then you need to refer them to the chain of command. And the chain of command works this way. You refer the person back to where the issue originated, right? Have you spoken to the teacher? Have you spoken to the coach, the advisor, whomever it may have been, wherever the problem originated? And if the answer is yes, and it didn't work out well, they move up the supervisory chain of command. So it may go to the athletic director or to the principal or whomever, but it proceeds up the operational side of the district until at the superintendent's desk it may not still have found a reasonable resolution. In that case, it would come before the board as the court of last resort in the district. If you have become involved in this issue prior to it coming here, you will have compromised your ability to render an impartial decision when you do actually have to pass judgment on that. So board members do need to move that problem to the chain of command side of things. Let your superintendent know very quickly, email, text, whatever it might be, that this is an issue that may end up in front of you. You should know about it. And then board members step away, right? You can't solve problems. That's not your job, right? And by the way, at the bottom of the slide, you can see that that's also specifically a piece in the Code of Ethics. Okay. When we talk about the governance core, which I mentioned earlier, that book that helps us understand the underpinnings of how a board member operates, you need to make a choice when you become a new board member, and the choice is: are you going to try to advance your own agenda as a single board member, or you are going to work together cohesively as a unit and work towards a common vision? Another term we have for that common vision is a moral imperative. What is it that you hold deeply about serving on a board that all of your board members can unite around and use as a rallying point to move the district forward, right? So you need to make that choice to work as a team rather than as an individual within a group. Talking about the superintendent's role, the superintendent has, as we see it here, three different sort of main areas of function. Firstly, being the chief advisor to the board. Obviously, your superintendent is in place because the superintendent is an expert within education, and you will rely heavily upon them to provide you with alternatives and recommendations and new ideas and things of that nature. The person is also the staff's liaison to the board, being the person who is in charge of the entire district from a personnel perspective. You would expect that the superintendent talks for the staff. Provides briefings, right? Things that the board may need to take action on, keeps the board briefed on things that are going on in the district, and also feeds back to the board about the policy that they've set to make sure that the implementation is going well and to suggest any changes that may need to happen if policy needs to be amended. Superintendent is also the executive officer of the district, right? We've talked about that a lot. He's completely in charge of the operational side of the district. So administering the policies that the board has put together, runs the district day to day, lets the board know anything that might be emergent within the district, is accountable to the district, and that's done through the evaluation process of the superintendent. And also, again, is the person who directs all the staff members through personal action, delegation, or any kind of supervisory activities. And lastly, the educational leader of the district. You would expect that your superintendent is well versed in all the current trends in education, remains active throughout their professional organizations and throughout the county and the state, and also brings ideas to the board for consideration to be acted on. So those are your three sort of main thrusts of the superintendent's role. When we look at the board and the superintendent working together, there are things here, themes that we've already touched on that I'm not going to repeat, but I think the most important thing is what we see here at the bottom of the slide. And I think it's important for both the board and the superintendent to understand that communication is key. No one wants to be surprised in the middle of a meeting, hearing about something that's gone on in the district that, they found out in the supermarket or on the soccer field. And certainly the superintendent doesn't want to be surprised about things that are bubbling up in the community that may show up in a public meeting and they're not prepared for, right? So no surprises at board meetings, no surprises within the context of our communication with each other. I'm just going to throw a couple questions out there. What would you say is the difference between oversight and micromanagement? You want to try, Cheryl? You're smiling. Mm-hmm. Pushing buttons and flicking levers. Yep. That's good. Anybody else? Again, I think one of the things that I mentioned before is probably fitting here as well, and that is if the board member is focusing on outcomes, you're probably in good shape relative to oversight versus micromanagement. If you're focusing on how we got there, you're probably a little bit too deep into the operational side of the district. So what about seeing that the schools are well run and administering the schools? Kind of the same, right? It's not our job to run schools. It's our job to tell the district where we want to go, right? What about supporting the superintendent and being a rubber stamp? Do y'all have committees? Good discussion in committees? Yep. So when you get to a voting meeting, for example, is there often a lot of debate about where you're going? How you're voting? No. Why? Yeah, of course, right? So when you see that boards have been sort of labeled as a rubber stamp for the superintendent, what's not apparent to the folks making criticisms like that is we've done all this work already, right? We've had these discussions. We're not rubber stamping the superintendent. We've already thrown our ideas in. We've already had that debate. We've already settled on a position, right? That's not a rubber stamp. That's having the right kind of discussions and then coming to consensus and moving forward, right? Once again, themes we've touched on before. I think the real key here is this working together to advance student achievement. That should be our goal from day one. A couple of slides that I stole from a new board member piece, and I think these things are important just to keep as refreshers. Studying the agenda. I wish I could tell you I've never seen a board member roll into a board meeting and unseal their packet for the first time. That's a disaster, right? Because what does that turn into? That turns into, if they're engaged at all, a bunch of questions that have already been discussed at your workshop or in your committee meetings. They just didn't look at them, right? So make sure that you are looking at your agenda and understanding what the items are you're going to be considering for your meetings. If you have questions, it's not great to just show up at the meeting and throw the questions out, right? Especially when questions could be answered beforehand, right? Your meeting should be a place where you're, and I'm talking about voting meetings, not workshops, where you've already resolved your stuff and you're going to pass your agenda, and then you're going to have those kinds of things that are, demonstrative to the community that you're doing the right stuff in your district. You're going to have presentations by students, you're going to have presentations by faculty, etc. So make sure you get your questions answered or at least asked prior to the meeting, whether that be to the chair of your committee, your board president, your superintendent, or your BA, right? Talked about surprises already. You do want to have surprise-free meetings. Nobody ever wants to be caught unawares that information that people are going to be looking for isn't available at the meeting. That's not a good look for anyone. So we talked about asking questions ahead of time. 10 to 7 isn't really ahead of time, right? Your meeting starts at 7. You don't want to roll in with that question 10 minutes beforehand. So understand that the folks that you may be relying on to give you that information are going to need time to gather it. All right. I don't want to go through the not playing to the audience bit. I think we've seen enough of that over the last 2 years from public bodies, but clearly it's nothing that you would expect a board member who's playing a team role would want to do. Obviously, thoughtful votes by doing your homework. Sometimes you may want to put something off because you don't have enough information, but sometimes you want to rely on your experts. You employ a superintendent who's qualified and experienced for a reason because they know what they're doing, right? And then finally, do be aware of any conflicts of interest. If you have a relative, and that's a pretty expansive definition, who works in a district, you may have an issue considering, discussing, or voting on certain issues. So if you have a question about that, do engage your board attorney in that. Good question. So the first question I would ask you is, what does your bylaws say? Because typically the bylaws of a board will say that there are 2 to 3 people in the district who have license to go speak to the attorney. And why? Because it costs money, right? You can't just have board members on a whim reaching out to the board attorney and running up legal bills, right? So normally your superintendent, your business administrator, and your board president would have the ability to reach out to the board attorney. Board members who have questions relative to that should go through one of those 3 by your bylaws. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. I'm a big fan of questions. I not only asked a million of them when I became a board member, because I realized very quickly I was in a new world. I didn't really understand how these things worked. So questions are great. I also made sure over my 20 years that when there was a new board member and I had my feet under me, sit them here. I'm happy to walk them through this. So questions are great, but do make sure that you understand the questions should be asked within the context of your role, right? It's not important for you to know. It's not important for you to know that we're going to use white American cheese instead of yellow American cheese on the grilled cheese in the cafeteria next week. That's not a board member's role, right? So try to elevate your thinking to those high-level areas that the board's responsible for. Ask the things that are relevant to your high-level and strategic role, right? And then also ask them in the right way. So we're not looking for gotchas, right? We're looking for things that have an inquisitive tone, right? I'm trying to learn here. Can you inform me? I'm trying to execute my oversight role in the areas that a board member is meant to do. We talked about folks who come in from a corporate background, and that's what I did as well. It's important for board members to understand that this isn't the corporate world. It operates very differently from the corporate world. The rules are different. Labor is regulated by contracts. things take a while, right? Everybody's had to deal with public entities before in their lives, right? You know, you're dealing with your municipality for a building permit, or you're dealing with the state for, you know, something else, licenses or passports or whatever it might be. Things can take time, right? Important to understand that going in. You can't drop into here going 110 miles an hour because it's a different environment. We talked about board having one employee, being the superintendent. We ask that board members respect the chain of command. It's actually, once again, built into the Code of Ethics. It's Tenet J in the Code of Ethics. Board communications funnel through the superintendent. And there are instances in which a board may work with folks below the superintendent. However, that is at the superintendent's direction. So if the superintendent decides to appoint Ms. Ippolito to run the finance committee and be the liaison to that committee, that's fine. The direction came from the superintendent, right? It's not the board saying, oh, you know, we're going to take the curriculum director, for example, as part of our committee. Doesn't work that way. And once again, one or two members cannot direct the superintendent. Any ideas as to why that makes sense? Right? Right? Sure. Superintendent reports to a body, right? Superintendent doesn't report to individual board members, right? Anything having to do with the superintendent, giving direction to the superintendent, should come from a majority of the board. Why? Well, a superintendent, as great as she is, only has 24 hours in a day, right? Superintendent's time is a finite resource. If we're going to expend some of that resource somewhere, shouldn't that be at the behest of the majority of the board, right? Only makes sense. A couple other pieces about the difference between being somebody who's, you know, running for the board or a community member and being a seated member of the board. Things that you say obviously carry greater weight now. Why? Everybody sees that big B on your head, board member, and goes, oh, they must know stuff that I don't know, right? So if you are saying things of a disparaging nature, know those are going to carry greater weight than if you were just sitting in the audience at a meeting, for example, or, you know, hanging around at the playground. So understand what's implied by your seat on the board, that you really have some kind of special knowledge, right? Be very, very conscious of the fact that sharing confidential information can cause real harm. The Open Public Meetings Act says that the business that the board does has to happen in public, and that's fine, right? There are 9 exceptions to that, and those 9 exceptions are those areas in which the board operates that you're allowed to move into executive session. The idea behind those is that if you have those discussions in public, they could be detrimental to personnel, to students, or to the board's position in negotiating, for example. So those things that are discussed in executive session must stay between you, other sworn members of the board, your administrators, and your board attorney, and that's it. There's no bringing spouses into this. There's no having discussions over your dinner table. It has to stay with sworn members of the board. You are sworn to uphold the confidentiality that you hear in executive session. Once again, respect the expertise of the superintendent. And then this lead by example piece, again, is quite applicable in some of the craziness you've seen on YouTube over the last couple of years. Kids watch that stuff, right? That's not the kind of thing you want to model for kids that you expect to grow up to be responsible citizens. So always be mindful of that as well. A couple other things, most of which I think we touched on directly, but I'll go through them real quick. Get involved in the day-to-day operation of the district. We saw where that's a violation of the Code of Ethics, Tenet D. Contact staff directly. We already established the superintendent is the person who manages personnel within the district. If you have something that needs to be communicated to staff outside of your child's teacher, it goes through the superintendent. Don't take on a task that's the job of a staff member. We can see that in a number of different places, whether it be on the athletic field or, in a club, for example. There's actual school ethics commission advisories about this. Board members aren't supposed to be performing jobs that really belong to staff, to the point where they can't volunteer on a consistent basis within the district. So, keep that separation of duties in mind. Don't engage in practices outside the chain of command. We talked about that already. You can't solve problems. Move those to the chain of command quickly. Let your superintendent know and step away. And make individual requests to the superintendent outside the work of the board. The superintendent is here to serve a body, not individual board members. Going to skip parliamentary procedure here, although I do think it's important that boards conduct their business in an orderly way, as the rules, Robert's Rule of Order, help to promote and maintain. This piece touches upon ethics. I think it's really important that board members understand, especially new board members, that you do in fact maintain your First Amendment rights. But you also have an obligation as a state official to exercise those First Amendment rights in consideration of your role as a board member. So maintaining adherence to the School Ethics Act and the Code of Ethics. If you do happen to express your opinion in public for whatever reason, you should use what we call the disclaimer. And the disclaimer was specified by the School Ethics Commission. Some of you may be familiar with the language, but the basic concepts are that I am, Matt, I am a board member. I am writing to express my own opinion and not that of the board. And that should shield you to a degree from any repercussions that might come back to you from an ethics perspective. Keep in mind, though, that if you use that disclaimer and then the content of your speech or the content of your writing is such that you have negated the value of that disclaimer, you can still be held responsible for those comments. So if you say, I'm Cheryl and I'm a board member, these are my opinions, but I just want to let you know that what the board did the other night was horrible and blah, 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 right? You've negated that disclaimer. You're speaking as a board member right there, right? Okay, we've touched on all these already. The last few slides here, especially for new board members, I really advise you to be patient. Understand that there is a cycle to governance over the course of a year. And I would suggest to you that it probably takes about 2 years to really get that cycle down, to be able to anticipate what's coming next, to think ahead about how you want to be prepared for the next step, etc. So take advantage of that time to learn. Obviously, choose to govern professionally. We've talked about that already. Be a systems thinker. And by that, I mean understand what those processes look like, understand what the governance cycle looks like. We're going to build goals, then we're going to report out on those goals, then we're going to assess on those goals, then we're going to recalibrate and formulate new goals, and then the process begins over and over again. So keep that in mind. Keep your focus on the strategic and high level. It's the best way to keep yourselves out of the side of the district that belongs to the superintendent. Do your homework, commit to the learning that's involved to be a good board member. Obviously, you want to be trustworthy. Keep this, relationship with your community solid. And once again, just skipping ahead to the 10th one, remember you and your board are modeling the ethical and moral standards you want children in the district to emulate. Couple last scenarios just to get your thoughts on. So in this first scenario, the district needs to be, a board member believes the district needs to be fiscally conservative. This member, who's a CPA, identifies several line items in the budget that could yield savings for the district. He then compiles a report and shares it at the next board meeting for consideration. Is that oversight or overstepping? Why? Perfect. That's perfect. That's exactly what I would have said. It's not their job. So if you wanted an analysis for savings in the district, which is absolutely, a legitimate board goal, what would you do? Sure. I mean, it would definitely originate in committee, I would suspect. But what's the action out of that? Perfect, right? We want to ask the professional who's responsible for that piece of the district to execute on that vision we have, which is savings against our current budget, right? This one is a little bit gray, but we're going to try it anyway. So high school principal updates the board at a meeting on the school's remote learning plan. A member asked the principal how the plan is addressing the school's widening racial and socioeconomic academic gap. Oversight or overstepping? Okay. Any other thoughts? You think overstepping? Yep. Okay. Any other thoughts? Exactly. You can infer from this that the scope of the presentation that this staff member was asked to give had to do with technology, right? And then there's a whole other facet to this issue that's probably not been addressed or required from the staff member. So basically, by widening this inquiry, the board members really put one of the staff members, back on their heels in terms of not having the information at hand in a public meeting. Next one. A board member believes the district has not been proactive, I should say, in responding to a recent decline in enrollment. The member contacted the superintendent and requested a detailed staffing and analysis report to be created and shared with the board. Oversight, overstepping? Perfect. Yep. You can infer from this that this report that's being considered here is a pretty substantial task, right? So if we're going to push the superintendent to do a substantial task, it should be a decision of the entire board, because obviously there are other things that the superintendent will have to de-emphasize for a period of time in order to get that done. And what does that cost to the district, right? Hypothetical school district planning a capital project that includes a synthetic field. One member is opposed, believing the field poses serious health and environmental risks. The member uses social media to share information on the issue and links an article with a comment. Don't be fooled or misled. Toxic turf is hazardous to your child's health. That's a big problem, right? And I have to say, I think social media is probably the place where you see most board members getting themselves in trouble lately. In fact, I think of the last 8 advisory opinions that came out from the School Ethics Commission, at least half of them dealt with social media. If you follow school board notes, you can see that those things have been capsulized lately. Yeah, this is a big problem. Not only is the board member acting against, the board itself, but also probably disseminating false information, right? Because I don't believe that the board would be considering something that is toxic and hazardous to your child's health. So that is the end of my slides. I thank you so much for your participation and for listening to me. I am open to any questions you have. Sure.
One of the things that's always concerned me is I don't know what I don't know,
Yeah.
right? So I think I've committed to deep learning. I've read the latest article that says that board members can say whatever they feel like, and I'm being sarcastic, and that was my deep learning. So, I mean, is there a way to help somebody learn or begin to know what they don't know, or at least to ask that question, to have whatever it is inside of you say, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not the right thing. So, I mean, are there places to go to ask that question, to commit to deep learning or things
Sure.
of that sort?
There's actually a number of places to go. It depends on the level at which you're operating at the time, right? Some things you may want to go directly to the School Ethics Commission, for example, for an advisory opinion, if it's something about proposed conduct. But as a general rule, if you have questions about board service, that's actually what I'm here for, right? My contact information is on the website. Pretty accessible. My wife will tell you that I spend way too much time in front of my computer. So I'm happy to help you with questions like that. In addition to that, NJSBA offers courses all the time. And I don't think you can flick a deep learning switch. I think it has to be a consistent commitment to taking courses over time, sort of spreading the breadth of topics that you cover in that learning, and understanding that this is incredibly iterative. I've been involved in boards for almost 30 years, and I still learn stuff. And, those are kind of the principles that I would be guided by. Does that make sense? Is it helpful? I mean, and there's absolutely no harm in bouncing something off of your superintendent or your BA. I mean, these are professional folks. Lots of training, lots of experience, lots of exposure, big networks of people they can rely on if they don't know the answer. So that's a great resource as well. And I would also encourage you to engage with county activities, because, the folks in Bergen County always show up to county meetings. We have 100+ people at each meeting, and it's a great place to establish a network and to kind of share perspectives from district to district, because I can assure you they all run differently. Under the same rules, they all run differently. Anything else? Thanks for listening. I will hope to see you all down the road.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you
coming.
so much.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you for everything. I'll be calling you later. Again, it's a joke. So, we've done the superintendent's report, the board secretary's report.
Yes. So just a reminder that there's still a need for a couple of you to complete your financial disclosure forms. They are due April 30th, and I know no one wants me to be hounding them. So please, I need to get those in. I know I sent correspondence out, but due to the governor's budget address being delayed and the release of state aid on March 10th with a little additional bonus of the Chapter 44 reduction for any district that was above adequacy, the county business administrator called me at 3:30 on Thursday afternoon to tell me that he would not be able to perform the fiscal review or the walkthrough on Friday. So we're rescheduled for the morning of April 8th. Stay tuned. Anyone who wants to walk along, you can come on over. Now I'd like to just bring to your attention that in the finance meeting, we talked about, obviously, the proposed 2022-2023 budget that is due to the county on March 28th. And as you heard me just say, we had a surprise of our own as it related to Chapter 44 and a reduction of our tax levy. And I'll just bring you back and give you a little history for those of you who don't know about Chapter 44. So the law was put in place July 1st, 2020. And one component of this law was the legislation got rid of a couple of, if you're in the state health benefits plan, they got rid of a couple of health benefit plans. And they reduced it to what they call the legacy plans, the Direct 10 and Direct 15. And they introduced a new benefit plan called the New Jersey Educators Health Plan. And along with Chapter 44 was a different calculation that would calculate an employee's health benefit contribution. Chapter 78 was based on a percentage of premium based on your salary, and Chapter 44 is based on a percentage of your salary, and it's capped. So that introduced a new calculation for those people who wanted to go into the New Jersey Educators Health Plan. Any person new to the district that had not been in another district was subject to being pushed into the new plan right away. If you happen to have transferred from a different district, you could keep your legacy plan if you chose. Embedded in that legislation was also the fact that if you were a district that was in the state health benefits plan and you incurred a savings, that savings would, if you were above adequacy, and that's defined on a formula in your budget program, if you are above adequacy, any savings that was attributable to Chapter 44 would be required to be given back to the taxpayers as tax relief. While that information was disseminated, it wasn't exactly clear as to how this was going to be calculated at the final day. So the first time that anyone in the state received the information and the formula was Thursday at 11 o'clock. So talk about no surprises, but we're here to come up with a solution. So the district was notified that based on the state's calculation of Chapter 44 with some input from myself. We, business administrators or boards, had to upload information regarding employees, their health plans, what their contributions were to create a net cost for the district. There was a comparison between 2019-20 and 2020-21. And based on the state's formula, they have arrived at the fact that Rivervale saw and is expected to give back $91,334. And where that comes is given back is they take that $91,334 and they go back to last year's tax levy and they reduce it, and then the 2% cap is permitted to put on top. And if this being your first budget, where the cap is on the revenue side. It's not on the expenditure side, it's on the revenue side. So when they talk about budgetary cap, it's tax levy to tax levy. So pretty simple to calculate. You start out with the prior year's tax levy, absent of any crazy adjustments, which are very few and far between. 2%, that's the maximum that you're allowed, except for a couple of exceptions. So state came in, said, based on last year, we're going to cut you $91,334. So now you're actually behind. So as you try to move forward, you're already lower. You're lower than the 2%. It works out to be 1.6. Now, historically, the board has felt and thought that the budgets have been prepared, fiscally responsible, that the educational goals have been met, financial obligations have been met, that the board wants to be sensitive to the community and the fiscal challenges. And since 2013, the board has stayed under 2%. So to give you a perspective, last year's budget came in at 1.89. So, starting out already at 1.6. There is a challenge process to this Chapter 44 reduction. We don't have any idea how long it's going to take to get a decision. I need to submit that challenge to the county office, and then the county office will be submitting down to a committee in Trenton to review the challenge. I don't see any way that they're going to be able to make a decision in time for me to continue the budgetary process and submit all of the information that I need to submit to the county by the 28th. My plan is to provide you with a recommendation. I will file the challenge to the Chapter 44 allocation and calculation, and we'll see where it goes. For those of you who have not been through the budgetary cycle, there is an opportunity after you adopt a tentative budget, and then at your public hearing, there is an opportunity to make changes to that budget. So my recommendation is that we move forward. I will continue to present to you the recommendations for the adopting a tentative budget tonight. I call it the technical budget because we submit paperwork. The county looks for enrollment projections, how many students are attending out of district special ed placements. They look for your budgetary line items. They look for statement of priorities. They look for all kinds of information, and it's submitted to them, and they go through and they make sure that all the I's have been dotted and all the T's have been crossed. If there is a positive outcome from the challenge, the board then has the opportunity to make changes at the public hearing, which is scheduled for April 28th. So that gives you more time. So we've been meeting with the Finance Committee's been meeting. We started the budget process back in September, just so that you're aware. Most importantly, there's not a lot of discretionary funds that we have to play with. We start with we have a settled teacher's contract, so we know exactly what their salaries are. And we will start negotiations with the custodial staff. But our collective bargaining units, our administration, they're all settled. We have the rates for the health benefits. That's another layer. To the best of my ability, I've been working hand in hand with the Child Study Team Director. We have projected our special ed enrollment and our out-of-district placements. I have those tuition rates. So as you can see, you start to layer the budget from an expenditure point of view. Just to give you a little history, now I need my glasses. As I said, the board has taken very seriously over the years that budgets have been crafted with the educational values and fiscal responsibility in mind. So there's been no addition to staffing at any of the schools. The state aid figure that was released, great news, as Mrs. Pintarelli stated, we received $161,426. I did take into consideration a recent retirement, so that amount of salary was lowered. Health benefits made that projection, and with all of that said, since 2014-15, there is a mechanism in which there is additional capacity that can be generated through rising healthcare costs that had happened in the past. Also, by not utilizing the full 2% of your tax levy, it generates what's called banked capacity. And that is able to be utilized over the next 3 years. And then the board, if they choose not to utilize that banked cap, it's not utilized. And it's a paper notation. It is, unless the board actively chooses to engage that option, no additional tax levy, no additional taxes are generated from that. So it sits on the side as a, hey, if you want to use me, you can, but you're not obligated. I'll just run down the fact that since 2014-15, there are 6 years worth of banked capacity totaling $715,000 that the board has chosen not to utilize because the budgets have been created and satisfactory for all goals that have been set, educational, fiscal. So what does that mean? There are still 3 years that the board has generated capacity. 2019-20, the board generated $25,000 in additional capacity. 2020-21, $25,000, and 21-22, to get to that 1.8, there was $24,000 that the board said we're okay with. We don't need to utilize that mechanism. My recommendation to the board, to the Finance Committee earlier, was that at this particular time, you should utilize the banked capacity in the amount of $74,000 to offset the reduction that the state has currently in play. What that will do is it will bring you to a budgetary cap, a tax cap of, and again, it's not a tax rate, it's the budgetary cap of 1.92. So that keeps you still underneath the 2%. It brings the board back to what we would consider whole, what the district's strategic plans have been, which is to stay under the 2%, because we don't know what's going to happen next year with this Chapter 44 or anything else at the state level. And we need to protect ourselves. So the 2019-20, if you don't choose to utilize that, will be not able to be utilized next year. So that's the recommendation that I have for the board for the tentative budget. Submit it, and then we can have further discussions, and if there's additional information, we can look at that together, and the board can make a decision at the public hearing as to either stay with the current budget that was approved by the county or make changes. Does anybody have any questions?
The budget, just to understand, last year we were at 1.89, this year we're at 1.92. So a very similar outcome.
Correct.
I have a question.
Sure.
Have we looked at the long-term ramifications of using, like at some point we've been reduced and we're going to use, for lack of a better phrase, just basically savings to supplement, right? Eventually that might catch up to us. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but has that been looked at after year 3, like year 4 or 5? How that could affect what we're doing here?
Yes, and it's also an ever-changing climate, as we know. So the good news is that last year and for one more year, the rules have changed in order to be able to carry undesignated fund balance. Previously, the board was only allowed to have 2% undesignated fund balance. And what I mean by that is it's not associated with a reserve or specific ideas or plans. And due to COVID, there was the state allowed school districts to carry 4%. So the school district currently, we are at 4% of non-designated fund balance, which is a first since probably 10 plus years. So that does act as a little bit of a savings. I do project that we'll be able to, again, make a deposit to capital reserve for future projects. This is really a recommendation to get us the tax levy back to a level, because if you start to go backwards, remember they're going back to last year's tax levy. They're not starting with this year and going down, because if they started with this year, you would have been 2% up and then they would have cut you. So they're already starting back, cutting you. So it's a compound reduction, and that's why the recommendation is to continue to accomplish our fiscal responsibility, is bring the tax levy up to where it's the 1.92, and then hopefully we'll have an answer regarding the challenge. And if we're successful, the board can seek to take that banked cap and put it back on the side. So you could make a recommendation to do that at the public hearing. Does that answer your question?
What would get in our way for that challenge if we were to challenge it? Like what would say,
Because it's pretty clear that the governor has made a promise to reduce taxes. So the news on my front is I think it's going to be, they're looking for something. They may not absolve us from the entire 91,000, or they may just say, nope, you're out of the box. But it's pretty clear that they put this legislation in place, and it is a 7-year stay on this. So unfortunately, we didn't have much time to analyze this, but looking forward, it's really learning what it is that we can do moving forward to help the district. But unfortunately, that's my answer for you. Anyone else? I think it's a great question. We constantly stay in touch. You know, at this particular point in time, I think we have all the staff that we need. But if we need to grow that, then we'll have to. We also have. I think we're also at a point where we may see some additional retirements at some point.
Okay, well, thank you, Kelly.
You're welcome.
That was, a lot. Very informative. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to general resolutions, items G1 through G6. Will somebody move it, please?
I'll move it.
Second?
I'll second.
Thank you. And discussion? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Certainly. Mrs. Berkowitz?
Yes.
Mrs. Pintorelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Schlereth?
Yes.
Mr. White?
Yes.
And Mr. Rossini?
Yes. Okay, moving on to business resolutions B1 through B16. May I have a motion to move B1 through B16, please?
I'll move it.
Second, please.
I'll second.
Okay, questions, discussion? Anything? No? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Certainly. Mrs. Berkowitz?
Yes.
Mrs. Pintorelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Schlereth?
Yes.
Mr. White?
Yes.
And Mr. Rossini?
Yes. Okay, and moving on to personnel resolutions P1 through P17. Anyone move it, please?
So moved.
Second?
Yeah, I'll second.
Okay. Discussion. I just note that number 2, Ms. Spar, is retiring. She's been in the district for so long, and her work is, just want to make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. It was, been greatly appreciated. Okay, anything else? No. Okay. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Berkowitz?
Yes.
Mrs. Pintorelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Schlereth?
Yes.
Mr. White?
Yes.
And Mr. Rossini?
Yes. Okay, now we're moving on to public comments on general items only. The Rivervale Board of Education is committed to encouraging the citizens of Rivervale and employees of the Rivervale School District to speak directly to the board trustees. In order to facilitate this communication, residents and employees are required, 1, to sign in before speaking, 2, to maintain an appropriate sense of decorum, and 3, to limit their remarks to no more than 5 minutes. The board will also take under advisement the written comments and opinions of non-residents that are submitted to the board secretary. Being mindful of its responsibility to maintain the orderly conduct of meetings, the board retains the right to rule on such matters as the speaker's right to address the board, as well as the appropriateness of the subject being presented. The board's decision in such matters is final. The board also reminds members of the public that while it subscribes without reservation to the principle of keeping the community informed, by policy and law, it cannot allow public discussion of personnel matters, nor can trustees comment on any current or pending litigation. If a matter concerning an employee of the Rivervale Public Schools is of interest or concern to a resident, the matter should be referred to the responsible building principal or the superintendent of schools by telephone, letter, or email. The public comments section for general items is open at 8:33. And seeing no one wants to make any public comments, I'm going to close it at 8:33. And moving on, we'll move on to old business. Anyone?
Yes, I would like to circle back to our last conversation regarding the National School Lunch Program. We're coming to the point where we need to make a decision regarding whether or not we will begin the application process. So I thought tonight would be a good time to discuss that. And if we decide to take part in the National School Lunch Program, I think there are some things that we need to consider. One being, we cannot continue the PTA lunch program if we engage in that in the National School Lunch Program. There may be a need for adequate space to store food or serve food. Some areas in, I guess, one of the 3 schools may need to be retrofitted to accommodate the program. Families could still order from various local eateries. However, that means that there could be an influx of meals at lunchtime. So how would we organize that? And who would make sure meals arrive on time? And what happens if a child doesn't get their meal? So there could be some issues with that. Let's see. We may need to hire staff. There would be no volunteers, I believe, but don't quote me on that. I'm also concerned that there are issues with, we have food shortage issues, so that would be another concern of mine. So I guess we need to have a conversation as to how we want to move forward with this.
And I also just want to reiterate too, we don't have any indication at this point that the National School Lunch Program is going to continue with the free lunch for all. I don't know if we've heard any other news on that, but as of now, we've been told that it's supposed to resume as normal next year, which means it would only be free for those who would qualify.
That's my understanding.
And I guess another question is, or my comment is, and I think the PTA lunch program has a mechanism to provide confidentially for anyone who may have trouble providing lunch for their own child. So I think that's something also to consider.
I think a big concern is incurring additional cost for the program, and the utilization rate will be lower presumably if it's not free for all, because people could still order outside the system if they didn't like the lunch, right? And then how long are we committed if we apply?
It's a 1-year commitment. I think you also need to just keep in mind that food service vendors right now, they may be struggling, and they may look at a Rivervale and say that based on the demographics, it might not be something that would generate enough money for them. So it would be difficult. Also, the National School Lunch Program does have criteria in terms of what can be on the menu, and I think that may come into play with some families because it's different than what they're used to. But that's if the board wants to move forward, we'll have to submit an RFP down to the State Department prior to May.
I was going to say, are you looking for a motion one way or another?
Yeah,
I'd like to make a motion that we not go forward with the school lunch program.
okay, yeah, so I didn't know whether it was discussion or whether we were moving to a vote tonight. Okay, and that's fine. Is there a second on that? Okay. Yeah, based on the difficulty and the tenuous position that it may not even be implemented, and if it were, our district probably wouldn't qualify. So now we have a second, I guess we'll have a vote. Okay. So a roll call vote?
Certainly. Mrs. Berkowitz?
Okay.
Mrs. Pintarelli?
No.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
No.
Mr. Schlereth?
I'm not
Yeah.
sure we're voting correctly. My motion was
Yes.
to not go forward with the
Yes.
program. So you might want so you might want to vote yet. Correct.
Yeah.
With the free lunch.
To remain
program.
as we,
Correct.
to remain as we are.
That's why I was wording it the way I said
Yeah, I was going to say something before I voted, but
The motion on the floor is to not proceed, correct?
Correct.
correct.
And
So
to-
I agree with that motion. So,
Yeah.
yes,
So you're voting
Yes,
yes.
and to remain as we are,
yes.
not make any changes.
Agree.
Yeah,
Concur with
let's
the
do it again for clarity. Let's do it again for clarity, don't you think?
Okay.
All right.
Mr. White, you want to float the motion?
Sure. I make a motion that we do not proceed with the federally funded school lunch program at this time.
And to remain as we are.
Does that make sense?
And to keep the
Yes.
district, to
Okay.
remain as it
Yes.
is. Not make any, yes, okay.
Second?
Is there a second? You're going
I will
to vote second
second
again, Tor? Okay. So I think now we're clear. So now we'll do a roll call vote.
Perfect.
And
Mrs.
Thank
Berkowitz.
you, Jason.
So now I will say yes.
Mrs. Pintarelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Schlereth?
Yes.
Mr. White?
Yes.
And Mr. Rossini?
Yes. Okay, well, glad we got through that. Okay. Is there anything else under old business that we should discuss, take care of? No. Okay, good. Anything under new business?
Yes, the motion to approve
Oh, that's
the
right.
tentative budget.
That's right. So we have an addendum here under new business resolution 1. And we're going to vote on them individually or all of them?
You can vote them all together,
Okay.
consent.
Okay. So can I have a motion to move new business resolution as seen on this addendum, NB1 through NB5?
I'll
Yeah,
move it. You go. I'll move it.
Second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Any discussion?
I just want to thank Ms. Ippolito. I think the idea of using bank cap, I think is a really good one. I think it meets the needs of the district while also, being respectful of the taxpayers. And being at 1.92 will accrue bank cap this year as well for any future things that could come up from the state. Is that accurate?
No.
I misunderstood that then, sorry.
That's okay. It's very confusing because the state's reduction of the original 2% using the 91, that brought you back down to that. What they were saying is that was your new baseline. So we're actually above their technical cap, but below what we've always been, which is the 2%.
I understand, thank you.
Yeah, I sat in on the committee meeting today, Finance too. It was just so much work, and as you can see, so much, our heads are spinning. But thank you, Kelly. That was for all your help. Apart from that, any other discussion? No? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Ready?
Yeah.
Mrs. Berkowitz?
Yes.
Mrs. Pintarelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Rothenberg?
Yes.
Mr. Schlereth?
Yes.
Mr. White?
Yes.
And Mr. Rossini?
Yes. Okay. Are we going into closed session? Okay, so we have no reason to go into closed session. We're not going to do that. So is there a motion to close the meeting?
I'll make a motion to close.
Okay. Second?
I'll second.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.